you may or may not know, November just passed, was Native American Heritage Month. Congress just sort of decided that. Long time ago, but they didn't really, but they did it because of this thing that because of the Indians and the Pilgrims thing. They actually chose November for Native American Heritage Month because the Indians were so nice to the Pilgrims. So you can understand that most indigenous people really make a much bigger deal about October. The Columbus Day holiday, changing that. Those are things that most Native Americans actually care more about. But we certainly, I know that many people get invited to public schools and city councils in November. Oh, good. And also, of course, just a couple of days ago, the Thanksgiving holiday was celebrated, and for over a century, 120 years, I think, the story of the Indians who came to dinner was told as the founding story of the nation. It was the Indians were invited to dinner, and they were nice, and the Pilgrims survived the winter. When I was a child, they dressed the people up as Pilgrim and Indians and had a little pageant. My father didn't want me to participate. It was hard to understand. He said, they're not real Indians, he said. So, 30 years now, is for 50 years now, 50 years yesterday, or Thursday, 50 years Thursday. American Indians from the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere, especially those from New York and up to Maine, have come down to Plymouth, Massachusetts, and had a rally, a demonstration, and actually a potluck as well, and the home of the so-called Thanksgiving to protest the false story told there. It all started, some 50 years ago when the descendants of the Pilgrims, they call themselves, the descendants of the Pilgrims Incorporated, invited the Wampanoag to come over and give a talk. And they came over and ready to give the talk, and they said, "Can we see what you were going to say?" And the guy actually shared his manuscript with these people, and they said, "We can't let you do that. You can't say those things. We'll rewrite it for you. It'd be nicer." So he said, "No, I'm going to call my friends." And he called a couple of hundred friends, and they demonstrated instead. And so now it's been going on for 50 years. So thousands demonstrate every year to remind us the Pilgrim were not simply innocent settlers setting up a camp in the wilderness. And the main reason for that, of course, is that Massachusetts, as the natives called this place, Massachusetts, was no wilderness. People inhabited Massachusetts. They cultivated crops, nurtured children, lived their lives on the land. And the wilderness story is therefore told for a purpose. It's a reason you say it's a wilderness, and you think, and you're told over it. There are history books assigned to freshmen today. It says, "Journey into the Wilderness, the Pilgrim Adventure, or the Puritan Adventure in America." It's no wilderness. When Pilgrims crossed the Atlantic Ocean in 1620, they landed on what is now called Cape Cod and South Shore, the location of 20 native villages. Those villages were joined in a confederation called the Wampanoag, which means people who greet the dawn. The natives had lived there for millennia. I think the earliest archaeological evidence is 8,000 years. That's a long time. lived in round roof houses that were made of poles covered by flat sheets of birch bark and sealed tight with clay and mud cement, very warm, very insulated, and probably just about the same technologies used in France and England in those days. The people, we may now call those houses wigwams, but they are nothing like the teepees that were used by the peoples on the Great Plains who moved, and where the buffalo herds moved. So these people who lived in these villages on the southeastern part of Massachusetts, and the people who lived here for that matter, lived in permanent villages. Permanent villages. And when I've actually seen people will do a thing about Pilgrims and the people Indians who greeted them, and they'll have a teepee. I've actually seen the people dressed up with feathers going up in the air, or lots of little feathers. Nobody wore those east of the Mississippi. Those are called head dresses, and they were worn west of the Mississippi. If you look at what exists east of the Mississippi, you'll understand why. You can't move if you go on trails where trees are low, they would knock your feathers off. So you don't wear it. You wear them on the plains where there are no trees. It just happens. So for these people who lived in these villages, in the spring they would fish in the rivers for salmon and herring, hunt lobster, shellfish, bluefish on the coast. They would, from December to April, they lived on food that they had stored for the early months: maize, beans, squash, jams, and jams. And the indigenous political economy was not all that different from agricultural Europe, Africa, or Asia at the time. Each village had its own leaders called in the village council. Now, a little different than Europe, political power flowed upward from the adult men and women of the village, who chose, by a process very much like what a church does, their moderators, called sachems. They chose them and made decisions together. Both men and women enforced the laws of the village. The Pilgrims, on the other hand, were a people accustomed to living in a hierarchical, feudal social order. They brought that social order with them. The property owners of Plymouth Plantations brought servants and mercenary soldiers in tow. Miles Standish was a professional soldier. He was experienced in the wars against Catholics in Europe and Ireland, and was known to burn down villages as a way of making sure that the Catholics would scatter and undermine the base of those armies. They also brought a way of looking at the world based on the notion of what we call domination and conquest. That God, in their view, had given them dominion over their families, and women were subject to the head of the household, her husband, her father, her master, depending on the relationship, but always, women were always subordinate. And God was seen as a very powerful king, whose power was unlimited, even by the processes of the cosmos. God didn't have to pay attention to gravity. God was good. God was good when his orders were obeyed. God's love was experienced as forgiving sinful children who begged for forgiveness and administered on the basis of merit. Now, these people from England knew as a matter of religion that mankind had dominion over the land and its creatures of the land, and the earth was to be conquered and owned. they had a version of the Bible that said dominion over all the animals, dominion over the earth. Now that might seem familiar to you. It's the kind of religion that still exists. It's the kind of religion that still has followers, still impacts the ethical and moral world of our body politic. It's a hierarchical religion, rule-based religion. The original people of this land had a different worldview. For the indigenous people, the cosmos was creative and sustaining, and the earth and the sky were themselves sacred. They did not depend on a sacred text for ancient revelations. And the earth did not belong to them. The earth did not belong to them. They belonged to the earth. She was their mother. The Bible Commonwealth set up in Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island and Connecticut, all had a common Indian policy. The Puritans viewed themselves as a chosen people, called to build a city upon a hill, and consistent with this was holy war mythology. And I would argue that if we look around, we still see holy war mythologies being taught. They viewed the indigenous people of New England and Canaanites. They knew the Hebrew story of the people who came in from, led by Moses and then by Aaron, as liberating people who were chosen, and they considered themselves to be chosen. And the people in the land were conquered by the ancient Hebrews, and therefore they were reenacting that biblical story, because those people were like Ammonites and all those Canaanites that were crushed by the Hebrews. They, the Puritans, were to conquer the natives in this place. The Indians were people to be enslaved and subjected to Christian rule. This was a general doctrine of the Christian churches of Europe, which argued that only Christians could rule the world. William Bradford, the governor of Plymouth Plantation, rejoices in his diary, that God had swept the land clean of savages by sending diseases among them. The scientists are now saying it might be the hepatitis epidemic that came off one of the ships, the slave ships that visited the coast and stole children. The indigenous people who met the Pilgrims were hospitable people. They were in the habit of being hospitable. But they were not stupid. They were wary of the Pilgrims for good reason. They had been raided for 20 years by people who came ashore and grabbed people and took them away for slavery. The Pilgrims landed, and they did not bring enough to tide them over. They survived by raiding the stores of grains and legumes of the indigenous villages of the Cape, and the place they came to call Plymouth. Mercenary soldiers and armed pilgrims made an encampment, and the first structures they built in Plymouth was a fort. And they lived by raiding other people's silos. They could not have survived if it wasn't for a man who came among them. And this man plays that story of that friendly Indian. The man who came among them was called Tisquanta. I'll get to Tisquanta in a little while. In most English stories, he's called Squanto. But his name is Tisquanta, and he's originally from the village of Pawtucket and he spoke English. Patuxet had been an exact site of the Pilgrims built Plymouth, and it was on Patuxet's grain stores that kept the Pilgrims from starving. Who was Tisquanta? 1605, that's 15 years before the Pilgrims came. Tisquanta had been captured as a slave. He might have been 18 years old. He had been captured as a slave, kidnapped by an English Marauder, which I used to call John Weymouth, but is apparently John Hunt. I don't know. Historians are constantly making your life interesting. Weymouth made his fortune by raiding along the coast of New England. And apparently he and other raiders and merchants left diseases among the peoples of this coast. Tisquanta was exhibited in England as a savage from the New World in circuses and carnivals. You go to the Lancaster County Fair in there, they'd have some savages from Africa or from the Americas, and they say, look. And during his captivity, he learned English. As a slave, Tisquanta was sold to the Spanish and ended up in the Caribbean. And Squanto was able to use his English language skills to get passage back to England, where he found Weymouth and a Hunt, or whoever it was now that the historians are making my life miserable, who sent Squanto back to this homeland in the company of another kidnapped Indian named Somerset. Somerset is believed was from the coast of Maine. Squanto and Somerset arrived in the spring of 1620, and they found that village deserted, skeletons everywhere. Everyone in the village had died at the hands of English slavers and their diseases. Squanto and Somerset stayed inside another village near Buzzards Bay. When Mayflower arrived in the autumn of 1620, Squanto and Somerset were informed that the English had come. And because they knew English, they were asked to go by the council to check them out. Squanto and Somerset watched the Pilgrims for weeks. Indigenous people could live close to a village and watch people without being detected, and they did. And after, they would go back to the Buzzards Bay village where Massasoit was, and they'd say, we're finding out these interesting things out about these people. And they concluded that these people were not slavers. They were not here to capture slaves. That was a big controversy. Were they setting up a permanent slaving station? No. There's something different about these people. Something really different. Something we've never seen before. Anybody got a guess? Women and children. They had never seen Europeans except adult males. Took a while to think about what that might mean. And they decided to make contact. Tisquanta and Somerset walked into the English village, and said, "Welcome," in English. And they spoke English. The Pilgrims were not in good condition. They were still living in dirt-covered shelters. There was a shortage of food. Nearly half of them had died the previous winter. And Pilgrims had brought wheat seeds to plant in the soil of Massachusetts. Anybody trying to grow wheat? So they were totally unprepared for living in this ecology. The Pilgrims were in a desperate situation and needed help. So they were asked, the Wampanoag had asked Tisquantum to stay with the Pilgrims for the next few months. His mission to find out what the English are doing. Find out what the English are doing. Doesn't make a good pageant, does it? The spy who came in from the woods. He thought by making friends with the settlers, they might provide a buffer against slave traders. They might provide trade goods. Indigenous people really like cast iron. Stoneware and cooking has got its limits. So, yeah. So Tisquantum stayed with the Pilgrims to spy on the Pilgrims, to try to forge an alliance and hopefully make friends. As Tisquantum's request, the indigenous people brought the Pilgrims deer meat and beaver skins and taught them how to cultivate corn and other new vegetables and how to build warm Indian-style wigwam houses, and he pointed out the poisonous plants and showed them how other plants could be used as medicine, and explained how to dig and cook clams and how to get sap from maple trees, and how to use fish for fertilizer, and how dozens of other skills they needed for survival in this ecology. By the time fall arrived, things were going much better for the Pilgrims. The maize, the corn they planted was grown well. There was enough food to last for the winter. They were living comfortably in their wigwams. They also had managed to build another European-style building beside their fort, squared logs. It was their church. They were now in better health. They knew more about surviving in this new land. So the natives and the Pilgrims agreed to a treaty, and there was a time, and there was this so-called Feast of Thanksgiving. Now, it was not called Thanksgiving. Nowhere in the diaries does it call it Thanksgiving. The first, I will skip the first Thanksgiving because that's a long story, but there was not for another 15 years that the word Thanksgiving was used in Massachusetts. After the defeat of the Pequot people, there was a Thanksgiving because they just murdered a whole bunch of Pequot people, so they called it Thanksgiving. Tisquantum asked the indigenous people to come. They were not invited by the Pilgrims, and they were surprised that just a whole bunch of indigenous people showed up, because their mission, remember, their mission is to build an alliance. They want that relationship with these people. And so they have to bring the delegation into the village. And the Pilgrims are not prepared. They didn't have enough food to feed a gathering of about 50 people for that long a time. And seeing that, Massasoit gave orders for the first order of his arrival to go home and get more food. And this happened that the natives supplied the majority of the food: 5 deer, wild turkeys, fish, beans, squash, corn, soup, cornbread, and berries. What's striking is recorded in the Puritan logs in their journals is that they were shocked that because the Pilgrim women followed the English way. They stood quietly by the table and waited until the men had finished eating. That's how women were doing it in that time in England. And the women, the Wampanoag women, sat with their men and ate, because that was their way. So that when they were given permission to clear the forest, the vicinity of Patuxet, and they agreed to live in peace. So it would be wishful thinking to think that this friendship lasted a long time, and the written record left by the Pilgrims indicate there was terrible disdain on the part of the Pilgrims toward the natives. They used words like heathen, savage, to define their hosts. The Pilgrims told their Indian neighbors that their Indian religion was ungodly, an act of damnation, and before too long there were huge clashes in culture, differences in beliefs surfaced, and differences in cultural practices, and then actual violence, and eventually war. The patriarchal structure of Plymouth became very concerned about the sinful example of Indian women who only wore a loincloth in the summer. They were shocked, and they said that the indigenous nudity would seduce their sons and provide a bad example for their daughters. At first, they also pushed the indigenous people away, and they wanted to get the natives gone. More and more armed English Puritans arrived, and with even more mercenary soldiers to lead them and instruct them, wars brought forth and pushed the natives off the land, and more natives were enslaved, and natives were sent to the Sugar Islands, places like Jamaica, Bahamas, and villages were burnt. The subsequent history of New England Indians is a long, long story. But suffice it to say, the descendants of the original people of New England are still here. They remember their culture, and they remember this story. So it's called a day of mourning, the gathering in Plymouth, the gathering around the United States. And we should be grateful. We should have Thanksgiving. It is good to be thankful, but it's a story. This so-called Thanksgiving story, this pilgrim myth that warrants protest and demonstration. It's not a demonstration against Thanksgiving. It's a demonstration against an insidious story. Let us sing a song to remind us that our generations that have gone before have brought us things that have given us strength and given us power and given us wisdom, but also the generations that have gone before give us things that we need to rethink, relearn. Let us sing, We Are Dancing Sarah's Circle.